Mark, you're very much, let's say, Foresight friend. I believe you met Alison at Ephemeral. I think so. That sounds about right. And like you've done a salon with us. We've had many. Okay, I don't know if I need to help. But yeah, long time Foresight friend and speaker, and it's always a pleasure. So let's see. Similar structure in the question is maybe you want actually, who knows about charter cities here? Who knows what it is and like feel really knowledgeable? Okay, so could you like really explain what charter cities are and like why they are important, what you see as being valuable there, and maybe maybe now, especially in the present, like is there something about the current context of our society that we live in that makes it so that it seems particularly interesting and important to you to work in that area, to explore this?
Sure. So charter cities are basically new cities with better laws, right? City-states, free cities have been a pretty dominant feature of human social organization throughout most of history. One of my favorite historical examples is the Hanseatic League, which was a league of free cities that fought wars with nation states and won some of those wars. And the kind of modern idea of charter cities tries to take this kind of historical idea, place it in the modern context, and figure out like how it can be socially useful. And I tend to think there are two relatively important examples for charter cities. One might be using charter cities for catch-up growth. So right now there are over 75 million new urban residents annually. Most of them are in Africa and Asia. New urban spaces need to be built for these residents, and oftentimes the countries that they live in are relatively poorly governed. So it might be difficult to start a business, difficult to pay taxes, difficult to hire people. There's a lot of kind of legal restrictions on commerce that cause these countries to be poor. And so the idea of charter cities for catch-up growth is to take these new urban residents, new urban spaces need to be built with them, combine this with governance reforms that make it much easier to do business, to grow, to invest, that hopefully can stimulate economic development and lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. And so some historic examples of this, Shenzhen in 1980 was a handful of fishing villages, 100,000 people total. The special economic zone was created that was probably closer to a charter city. Within 5 years, they had the tallest buildings in all of China. The first year, they attracted over half all foreign direct investment in China. They pioneered labor markets, land markets, stock market, these things that ended up spreading throughout the rest of China, helping to lift 800 million people out of poverty over the last 40 years. So that's how charter cities can play a role in catch-up growth. And my nonprofit, the Foresight Institute, does a lot of work in Africa on kind of new city development, secondary cities, to help implement these kind of good governance ideas that can lead to sustained economic development greater than what it otherwise would have been. The other role that charter cities can play is kind of in high-income countries, pushing the frontier. And so we've seen in the US, for example, there's been a lot of, sclerosis in government functions. COVID made this all quite apparent on numerous dimensions. And the question is, how can we try to break out of this sclerosis? And obviously, we should try to reform US policy. That's good. But another way to do it is create areas that allow for a little bit more innovation that can implement a much more effective regulatory and administrative structure and kind of attract capital, push boundaries on that margin. And so I'm working on a project in the Caribbean where we're negotiating with a government and a large landowner to hopefully create a city that can allow this type of innovation, this type of experimentation, and demonstrate what kind of world-class legal, regulatory, administrative structures look like. Because right now, in a lot of countries, they're kind of mediocre at best.
And yeah, what do they look like actually? Like, how do you decide like what's world-class administration and governance? Can it be different? Is it like self-chosen? Like, how does it work?
Sure. I think part of it depends on the context. You don't want the same kind of governance structure in France in 1938 as you do in France today. right? 1938, France should have been basically a military garrison state because they were about to be invaded. France today does not need to have that focus. So ideal governance tends to be a little bit of time and place dependent. When we look at emerging markets, this kind of just largely means making it very easy to enter the legal and formal economy, minimizing legal and regulatory restrictions to trade, to investment, and opening markets up, combined with a very efficient administrative structure, right? Make it so when somebody goes to get their driver's license, it's very easy. Maybe they have their driver's license online, not having to go to 15 different offices and having to bribe 3 different people. In high income countries, I think those principles still matter, right? You want a very efficient administrative structure. The DMV is obviously not known for efficiency. And then 2, you want legal and regulatory frameworks for kind of new and emerging technologies. So the FDA is kind of a classic example of making it very difficult, prohibitively expensive to come up with new drugs. And what would it look like to have a kind of alternate regulatory structure? The answer is I don't fully know. I mean, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just you without private insurance. Maybe you want some kind of quality control. That depends on what the kind of goals of the city or zone are and how they kind of interrelate within the wider structure. But basically, for high-income countries, you want to open it up for emerging technologies, biotech, drones, VTOLs, and still have a kind of effective administrative structure with a relatively open business environment. And then also migration, people matter. So you need to make it relatively easy for people to get work and residence permits.
And do you build in mechanism to allow changes in governance, like updating basically continuously the values or the system of the city?
Yeah.
Is it more like top down, bottom up?
The way we think about it is, right, you might have a city council. In the US, the city council is voted on. In the US, sometimes you also have a mayor, sometimes you have a city manager who's basically a non-political executive. And we think about the same lines, like, all right, you have a city council. The question is, where does that city council come from? And for these projects, because you need private investors to invest tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in capital, right, they get some seats on the city council. You might have the national government get some seats. You might have residents or businesses get other seats. You would negotiate that on a case-by-case basis. Then that city council would have, right, the city charter would have some set of legal and regulatory rights that they might have zoning and land use. They might have work and residence visas. They might have drug and medical device regulation. And that would all be kind of passed by law at the national level. And then within that legal framework, the city would be able to update over time. And so as the city gets richer, it might want to, for example, create, you don't want, you want perhaps different zoning and land use regulations when per capita income is $1,000 versus $10,000, right? You want different food and safety standards when per capita income is $500 versus $5,000. And so you want that flexibility to be able to update the kind of regulatory structure over time. But I think to attract the kind of capital necessary to start these projects, you do want a somewhat stable kind of city council that can ensure that you're not making rapid changes to administration, et cetera, that would then threaten that potential investment, because capital is tricky to get and you need to make sure it feels safe to actually flow into these projects.
Interesting. Anyone has questions on this point specifically before I go further?
There are examples of charter cities in the US and specifically California. And then follow up on that would be if we wanted to create charter cities, well, maybe answer that question.
Sure. There are charter cities in the US, but they're not really the same as how I'm referring to them. The way I'm referring to it is a charter city would have some degree of like legal and regulatory autonomy from the central government. The cities in California do not have that. They're called charter cities, it's the same term. It's functionally different concepts.
Yeah. So what would we need to do to create one in California? And presumably the main advantage to doing it would be it's a special tax zone where you don't get charged the.
Yeah, I mean, you would want, I mean, depending on what you're going for, national or state level, I'm relatively pessimistic on charter cities in the US. There's not, right, the US is already very urbanized, so you have to compete with existing urban centers, and convincing a lot of people to move to the middle of nowhere is very difficult. 2 is convincing governments to give you those kind of concessions is also very difficult. California's made relatively good progress in the YIMBY movement, right? They passed a lot of laws to make it much easier to build. I would not recommend trying to convince them to create a kind of tax-free EMB jurisdiction. I mean, please try, but like I wouldn't use my time to go pursue that because I think it would likely end without much success.
We had Jason and Raymond, and after we can.
Be an easier stepping stone to go through company town.
Yeah, you could. So, right, the challenge of new cities often is how do you get the first 1,000 people there? And there's several ways to do this. Historically, there's kind of an economic reason. So there's a natural port or there's a mine, enough people move there, it becomes self-sustaining. If you're a government, you have very deep pockets, and then you can force bureaucrats to live there. That's St. Petersburg, that's Astana, Abuja, Brasilia. Lastly, yeah. Lastly, there is kind of a religion where it's kind of a strong civic culture combined with persecution. That's Salt Lake City or Israel, where persecution causes mass migration. Civic culture coordinates that to a single place. If you're a company town, it's like government-esque in the sense that you have very deep pockets. You can hire a bunch of people, live there. There have been some, like Henry Ford tried to build Fordlandia in the Amazon. It's unsuccessful, but right, like it's the same principle. So if you like you could imagine something happening in Starbase with Elon's kind of heavy investment there.
Right. I meant less of the source of funding, but more of the regulatory permissions.
It depends on the amount of leverage the company has with the government, right? The regulatory permissions are going to be a negotiation with the relevant government authority, whether national or state. And the company town might buy you deeper pockets for those negotiations, but it doesn't really fundamentally alter the political dynamic.
Him?
You started a charter city project. How do you think how do you determine what are positives and outcomes and what is brought up the example of the FDA. Obviously there's very group for the FDA, but even if the FDA were optimal, there's fundamental trade-offs to things like consumer protection, to like speed of drug delivery. And that those types of trade-offs and considerations extend to like general things like, are you prioritizing economic development versus like cultural goals or things like that. So I'm curious how you think about that and come to that as a body and the idea of a charter city versus like, when you go to a place like Africa.
Yeah, I mean, in Africa, we're focusing mostly on catch-up growth, right? We're not going to be, it'll take a few decades before they're kind of pushing the frontier on new drug development, for example. So they're mostly what the kind of the metric that we look at is, will this project increase economic growth rates by 1 to 2 percentage points over the surrounding region over a sustained time period, right? And so the question is basically, does this help alleviate poverty over a long time horizon? And then also other inputs like what is the urbanization rate? What are the kind of infrastructure costs? What are the regional trade networks that can plug in? What's the stability of the government? So can we be assured that like if we create this, there won't be a power change where the new power will end up not wanting this? With kind of high income countries, it's a little bit different. I used to be much more bullish on using kind of biotech or like drones and aviation as an anchor. I still think those are good things, but I think most of the anchor, for example, would be basically immigration arbitrage. And so that would be, right, the US, there's a few years ago, there were 200,000 H-1B applications annually. Now they're 450,000. I expect that number to increase. And I don't expect the US to become substantially more welcoming for high skilled immigration. And so I suspect that's where kind of the talent tool, if you're working in the Caribbean or Central America, would come from, that would justify the capital investment. In terms of like how I think about the like high income charter cities, my broad motivation is, I don't know, progress studies adjacent, where I think kind of like Hong Kong showed the rest of China, like, hey, they're Chinese people and they're not poor and they're not starving to death. And this shows that like you can do it too. And right, Shenzhen was just across from Hong Kong. That degree of cultural learning led to sustained economic development. And similarly, I think if you get a really successful charter city kind of relatively close to the US, hopefully, one, you can make lives better for all the people who currently reside there, who might reside there in the future. But two, hopefully you can use this to nudge the US debate in a positive direction over what effective governance looks like, and maybe cut through some of the kind of culture war issues that often kind of like get jammed up in terms of thinking about how to improve the US. I mean, I generally don't think most cities should be reinvented. Like it's the idea of a charter city is to focus on greenfield site where there aren't many special interests. So, right, like, all right, could you imagine Miami with a better legal and regulatory regime? Probably. Like, if you think about San Francisco, they could like legalize housing. You don't need a charter city for these things per se. Like, there's a lot of policy and other improvements that you can make for cities. The idea of a charter city is kind of a, I don't know, comprehensive framing and idea for areas that potentially have rapid urbanization and are kind of embedded in regional trade networks that would benefit like kind of greatly, where you can make this change. And as a result of this change, there's kind of materially noticeable difference in outcomes over a 5 to 10 year period. And so, yeah, there's lots of changes, I think, that improvements that can be made in cities, but they don't need to be kind of within the charter cities framework. They just need to be kind of things that might make the cities better or more livable.
My question is going to be, maybe you've already answered this, sorry, but what are some examples?
Yeah, I mean, historic examples like that might be proto-charter cities, or like Singapore, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Dubai, right? All of these had some degree of self-governance. Singapore is independent. Hong Kong was British, then one country, two systems. Shenzhen was a special economic zone that had really, really deep authority. Dubai, part of the UAE. And right, all these are like kind of embedded within regional context at different reasons for growth. In terms of other kind of examples, in Honduras, you might have heard of Prospera. That has a lot of charter city-like elements. There's a few other projects in Honduras as well. You have like Irvine, California. It's not a charter city, but it's a planned city in California. It has about 230, 250,000 residents now. Disney World is like has some charter city elements, right? They do have a lot of concessions from the state of Florida. They don't need kind of the same like licensing and regulatory procedures that almost all other developments have. And they created a like water resource, what's it called? The Reedy Creek District, that basically governs their wetlands, that it's voted on by land ownership. So Disney owned 98% of the land, so they have full control over that. Though this might have changed recently. I haven't followed the fights with DeSantis and Disney, so they might have restricted some of those, some of that authority. So there's a lot of pseudo examples, kind of examples that, yeah, can be learned from.
Some of the goals of your institute
Yeah. So we work with a handful of projects in Africa, as well as some in Latin America, mostly in Africa, as well as we work with kind of governments and kind of thinking about how to, one, develop new charter cities, or two, bring kind of charter cities principles to projects where they might not be full charter cities, but they still might benefit from some of these learnings.
Evan?
I feel like the harshest criticism that one could levy against charter cities is that, like, the goal of governments, as they are in theory, often not in practice, is that they're supposed to equally represent the will of all of the people. And I feel like charter cities have this reliance on capital at some point, and like often profitability or growth that would result in this being a shift where like you're creating these clear cutouts from the like excluded, where they're excluded from being exposed to the will of the people, and instead are like exercising the will of like a more capital based.
Yeah, I mean, I think like we kind of create lots of carve outs like for democracy. I mean, that's what the Bill of Rights is, right? Historically also, right, like independent central bank or independent judiciary are both seen as like very important for democracies, and these are explicitly shielded from the popular will of the people.
Yeah.
If you look at Saudi Arabia, for example, there's a lot of like Indian migrants to Saudi Arabia. You can imagine carving out a city in India and saying, we won't have democracy, but we will have Indian civil rights protections. So, right, much better than Saudi Arabia on civil rights protections, but still no democracy. Like, to me, and then it would have Saudi Arabia per capita income levels. Like, would a lot of Indians move there? My guess is yes. No, in India. I'm using a hypothetical example. I'm saying, imagine a city in India that has Indian level protections for civil rights, but Saudi Arabian levels of democracy and Saudi Arabian levels of per capita income. And I think a lot of Indians would be happy to move there, as a lot of Indians are already moving to Saudi Arabia, which does not have any of those civil rights protections and is much further away from India. And so my point is, like, democracy is important, voting is important, but also I think respecting kind of how people vote with their feet is also important. And I think we need to think about kind of balancing some of these things, like what does it look like? How do we embed the different institutional contexts? And so, like, I see charter cities as a policy tool for specific challenges that humanity faces, like very rapid urbanization and stagnation in upper income countries. It's not a universal tool, but it can help solve these problems. And I think it does require us to think about balancing some of our values a little bit differently than we might historically. And if you don't like it, I don't know, don't move.
That's a really interesting point, actually. The idea of like, voice or exit. How do you, so in that case, if you're voting by like being there or not there, do you think that the city need to facilitate like entry and exit, like in some way, make it, because there is a cost, right, like to moving. So people who are like poor and have no rights may potentially get stuck. Is there like, some sort of like mechanism so that people are able to change, choose, like, and have agency between, cities?
I think it depends on the context. So we did a little bit of work with Ciudad Morazan in Honduras, and there it's outside of San Pedro Sula in the industrial quarter. They were targeting low-income workers, and there the exit costs are basically zero, right? You're on a 3-month lease. And if you want to move, you have a friend with a pickup truck who comes and picks up your stuff, and you spend an afternoon moving. That's one example. For an example that we're working on the project in the Caribbean, right? Like the country is not going to want to allow a bunch of low-skilled migration. So we can target high-skilled migration and have people move. Of course, we're not going to restrict exit, but like a critical component is to allow much easier kind of work and residence visas. If you want to allow low-skilled migration, and you're worried about people getting trapped there, you could require migrants below a certain income threshold to post a bond, $500, $1,000, whatever, enough to buy a plane ticket back where they're coming from. That way, if something happens, you can do that. So I think there's a lot of design mechanisms that you can implement to ensure kind of, relatively open travel. That's ultimately going to come down to kind of how you are working with the host country, their government, what their interests are in terms of increased migration patterns and how you balance the challenges.
And okay, do you ever think about since we also have to do the dystopian scenario, like what's the dystopian scenario for charter cities? Like what could possibly go wrong?
There's a lot of them. One is just like, if you are worried about existential risk, having lots of political units potentially means that these political units could push technologies further and develop potentially world-ending technologies, right? It's much easier to regulate a single political unit than multiple political units. So that's a potentially bad outcome. Two is, like Dubai is fine. I like visiting Dubai. It's a good city, but like if the whole world becomes Dubai, that's probably bad. They're not very friendly to lower income people, to kind of anybody. If you're Emirati, it's great, but like otherwise, all right, if you're productive, that's great, but like probably don't want to raise kids there. You probably don't want to get sick there. You probably don't want to like have a, hard time in your life over an extended period there. Like modern states are in effect like social safety nets. That's a large part of their function. I think that's generally good. And charter cities where there's much lower cost exit would degrade that function, and there's a percentage of people that would probably substantially suffer for that degradation.
Yeah.
Go back to my other question about having a charter city in California. You're pretty negative about the chances of that, and if you could be specific as to if you propose that, who would be pushing back against that?
I'm not super familiar with California politics, but my guess is everyone. If you just to me, the best example is the YIMBYs, right? The YIMBYs have spent a decade building a coalition, getting some wins at state level, and there is a strong kind of historical, anti-building bias. You look at them trying to build a high-speed rail, right? You had a French company come in, leave, go to, I think, Morocco, build a high-speed rail and basically say, look, North Africa is better governed than California for large infrastructure projects. You get environmentalists who say, what about the fish? What about the birds? What about whatever? You'll get property owners who will say, what about this or that? You will get agriculture who says, oh, they need water. We don't want to kind of give up our water rights.
Where do you live?
I split my time between DC and the project in the Caribbean.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't really combining the best parts of each. It was just a thought experiment to show that oftentimes people are willing to give up certain political rights for much better living standards. I mean, combining political units is always difficult and tricky. Like the EU, I think generally has been a success, but there's also been lots of kind of tension as its creation. In the US, again, successful, but we fought a civil war. There've been lots of unsuccessful amalgamations of political units. Central America was at one point amalgamated. Kind of northern South America was all like the Bolivian Republic or something. I forget the formal name. So I think, yeah, like thinking about the optimal size of political units, the optimal functioning is, I think, very important. Charter cities are one subset of this class. I think there's one really interesting paper I saw recently on Twitter. Basically looked at cities in late medieval Europe, and the cities would often change political jurisdiction because of wars. And the immediate impact was negative, right? They would lose population, people would move out, life indicators would go down. The long-term outcome was actually positive, because what happened is the political units would say, oh, we have a better administrative structure, or we can integrate this city better into our trade networks and patterns, whatever. And so they would basically extend more resources to conquer the city. And it was an allocation mechanism for where cities should be and what political units that, right, short-term bad consequences, long-term good consequences. I think, right, we don't want to obviously fight wars to lead to changes of jurisdiction in different units, but I do think we should think creatively about, like, are the current political kind of units optimal? What would it look like to move to different forms of political units? When people talk about voice and exit, they talk about people exiting political units, but you can also talk about like nested political units exiting one like layers above and going to different layers, et cetera. What that would look like, how that would kind of improve outcomes. And so I think we should think, yeah, creatively about what kind of different structures of political organization leads to what types of outcomes, and how we want to think about that within our kind of set of values.
Very cool. Thank you for this session. A great discussion. And